Hello, my name's Anne Irons and I'm the examiner for Paper F5. Today though I'm here not just to talk about F5 but to talk about all the different fundamental level papers and to really hopefully give you some ideas about how you can improve your studying in order to achieve success in the exams. I'll just start off with a brief mention of the different ways that you can study. Now obviously how you do study depends on one, what your financial position is, and two, whereabouts in the world you live, because sometimes you won't necessarily have the option of attending formal classes. So option one then is you yourself and you really self-studying at home, whereby you'll get hold of the study materials and you'll actively work through each chapter, practicing questions at the end of each chapter. I'll talk a little bit more about question practice later, but it's very important that you review each question carefully to see where you went wrong. So that's you self-studying. If you're one of the lucky ones, you'll get to receive some formal tuition. Now obviously with formal tuition, you attend classes and someone effectively teaches you, if not all of the syllabus, then certainly large parts of it for each subject. The problem I find is that students who attend tuition sometimes tend to think that attending tuition alone is going to be enough to help them pass the exam. They like to be spoon-fed everything. Now, unfortunately, that is not the case, and for every day that you spend at tuition, you should look to be spending another day at home also going through the material, so that everything you cover in class is reviewed afterwards. And then always follow up, not just by reviewing the material you've learned, but by practicing questions at home as well. Now obviously once you're familiar with all the material, you start getting into what I would call the revision phase. And I tend to think of the revision phase as being really about a 6-week period. Now you should start your revision phase then with writing out a realistic timetable. And I tend to think of a timetable a bit like a rolling budget. Start off with your idea of what you hope to achieve during the period, but obviously things happen and sometimes changes need to be made, so tweak your revision timetable as you go along. It's very, very important that your timetable is realistic. There's no good in setting a timetable where you've said that you're going to get home from work and do 6 hours study every night. That's just not realistic. So set something that's realistic. On revision then, really in the same way that you would do during kind of the tuition or the study phase, you want to work methodically through each syllabus area, referring back to course notes where you need to, and more than anything, by this stage, you should hopefully be practicing questions. It's so important when you practice questions that you don't just do a question, but you review it carefully afterwards. And I think as a student, this was probably something that I didn't do as well as I could have done. How many times have you sat in an exam, come across something in a question and thought, I remember doing that in one of these past questions, but you can't remember the answer and you get so cross with yourself. The reason you can't remember the answer is because you didn't review the question carefully when you did it. So practicing questions and reviewing questions go hand in hand. It's also relevant to say then at this point that reading the suggested answer is no substitute for practicing a question. Again, guilty as charged. I remember audit, something I probably found quite difficult to get excited about when I was a student, although I did practice audit for a few years. But those audit questions, they were difficult to sit down and be disciplined about doing. And I thought it was fine. I thought I was revising if I sat there, looked at a question and read through the suggested answer. No, no, no. That is not going to secure your success in any subject. Okay, don't just read a suggested answer. There's little to be gained from it. Sit as many past papers as you possibly can, carefully reviewing them afterwards, and then also reading past examiners' reports. They will give you lots of ideas about pitfalls you might come across. A few do's and don'ts for you then, some of them more obvious than others. Now this first one then, do practice writing for 3 hours solid leading up to the exam day. That may sound bizarre to you, but how often nowadays do you find yourself sitting down and writing for 3 hours solid? I can't remember the last time I did it. And actually, I'm left-handed and I'm also cat-handed. So for me, it was an even bigger issue because I used to get really bad cramp in my hand. And you need, before the exam, to have sat down at regular intervals and hopefully practiced a past paper and sat writing solidly for 3 hours. Because if you get an hour into that exam and you can't write, you're going to be losing valuable time. So that's my first do on the list. The second one then, again, may seem obvious. Do get a good night's sleep before the exam. This was something that certainly was always a problem for me. And the reason why I think it was probably a problem was because I was always one for sitting there the night before an exam and doing those last 3 hours revision. And what do you do when you're revising? Drink coffee. So there I was till 11 o'clock at night, 6 cups of coffee, and then I thought I'd be able to go to bed and switch off and get a good night's sleep. No, I was always the one lying there till 3 o'clock in the morning. Finally, actually, you fall asleep about 5 o'clock, then the alarm goes off, and then you practically crawl into that exam hall looking so rough, okay? My advice to you, avoid the stimulants the night before the exam. Try not to leave your last-minute revision to really be in that last minute and get a good night's rest. Thirdly then, do take into the exam a calculator, a long ruler, you'll certainly need that if you've got a linear programming question in my paper, and several pens into the exam hall. That may sound again very obvious, but I saw papers again in this last exam sitting where candidates hadn't taken calculators into the exam. And really, there's no excuse for that. You're training to be an accountant. Accountants and calculators go hand in hand. That's why we are called number crunchers. Fourthly then, don't take any notice of the exam tips in various magazines. I laugh at these exam tips. It's just some random person sitting down trying to guess what we're going to examine. It means nothing. Don't even read it, apart from afterwards to have a good laugh at. And then lastly, and again, most of you will think that you'd never do this, and probably most of you wouldn't, but there'll always be some that would. Don't learn past paper suggested answers and repeat them, irrespective of the question being asked. For example, in F5, there was a bit on pricing strategies in both the June paper that we've just had and in the previous December's paper. I saw people that had learned December's paper and they were quoting verbatim from it in June's paper, even though it was a totally different question. It doesn't make you look good, so not a wise idea. I want to say a little bit now then about reading and planning time, and here I'm talking about the 15 minutes reading time that you get at the beginning of the exam. Now obviously the purpose of this 15 minutes reading time is to make sure that you've had time to have a read through of the whole paper. You know, the whole paper has been written with the fact in mind that it should be able to be read cover to cover in 15 minutes. First point then, only write on the question paper. If you start writing on your answer paper, you're going to find one of the invigilators coming up and tapping you on the shoulder and treating you like a criminal. So only write on the question paper. Please don't write on your answer paper. It's going to get you into trouble. Secondly then, make sure that you then, obviously the first thing you're going to do is you're going to have a skim through the paper just to see what's on there. We all do it. Look through, you know, if there's a particular topic that you're quite scared of, you're going to look through and you're going to pray that that's not on there, but it may be. So the first thing you're going to do, flick through, have a look at everything. And then you're going to go through question by question. And obviously, as you look at each question, the first thing you should do is make sure that you read and understand the requirement. And as you look at that requirement, underline the key points in it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. If you don't read the requirement first, how are you going to know what you're looking for in the actual scenario? So read the requirement and then actively read the scenario. And what we mean by active reading then is that you're going through the scenario with your pen in your hand, highlighting key figures, highlighting keywords, making little notes, perhaps performing a few simple calculations, although not too many, because remember you need to have all your workings on your answer paper. But you're actively reading, you're thinking at the same time. You know, when I'm teaching in class, when my students are about halfway through their questions, I walk around the classroom and I look to make sure that my students have annotated their questions. If I come across anyone who's doing a question and they've got no annotations on it, I name and shame them. To remind them, I'll call their name out in the class and we'll all have a good laugh about it. Now that sounds a bit harsh, and it's not done harshly really, but really just to drill into people that you must actively read. Otherwise, when you come to do that question, when the 15 minutes reading time is up, you're going to be starting from scratch again, because all that you've really done is read without actually thinking and understanding what you're doing. Also in your reading time then, allocate all of your marks to your different parts of each question. Not just to one question, but to the different parts of each, A, B, C, etc. A couple more points then on reading and planning time. This could be a good time to start to plan your answers. Now, these aren't the kind of plans that you might have done at university, but here, we're thinking really, what headings might you want to use in your answer? What way might you want to set out your calculations? If it's an audit question, maybe you want to use columns for your answer, that kind of plan, not a detailed plan of every kind of thing that you're going to write. You haven't got time for that, nor is there the need for it. Also then, having looked at the whole paper, decide the order in which you're going to answer the question, starting with your best question first. That is so important. The first question on the exam paper creates an impression of how much you do or don't know. Now, believe me, if your first question that you answer is really poor, straight away the marker is thinking, this person hasn't got a clue. And therefore their expectation of you is really quite low. And to be honest, if I see a poor first answer on a paper, I just sit there and think this person's going to fail. Now, because it creates an impression of who you are and what you know, if then later on in the paper something's a little bit ambiguous about what you've written and the marker has to decide whether or not you're saying what you should be saying, they're not going to give you the benefit of the doubt if you've got off to a bad start in the paper and you didn't look very knowledgeable. So, work out which question am I going to start with, in fact, which questions are then going to follow on. So answer your paper, first question is your best one, and then you have your next best one, and then so on and so forth. And of course, it's very important that you think during this time. Think about what the question's asking you. It's a common misconception then to say that there's no time to think. And I've got something here to tell you that the UK tax examiner then said in his Examiner's Approach article about thinking. And he said, it will be important that candidates think before they start to write an answer in order to identify the relevant issues and the calculations necessary to support their advice. In addition, they should consider whether the necessary calculations could be carried out in a particularly efficient way. For example, it may be that the client will be a higher rate taxpayer regardless of the particular strategy chosen, such that the income tax implications can be computed at the margin without the need to prepare full income tax calculations. Similarly, candidates should try to avoid producing detailed pro forma calculations, for example, of capital allowances, when a simpler working will provide the figure required. So please, don't ever think that there's not time to think. The examiner has given you time to think. A couple of quick general points then for all questions before I start getting more into kind of what you should do for written questions versus what you should do for calculative questions versus what you should do for MCQ questions. For all questions then, always start a new question on a new page. This makes it much easier to mark. Always read the requirement of a question first, which we mentioned before. Actively read the whole question, making annotations. Again, we've mentioned that before. And please, once you've started a question, finish it before you move on to the next. If you find that maybe you've done part A and B and part C you're not quite sure about, leave some space for it and come back to it. But don't have an exam paper where you've got question 1A followed by 2B followed by 3C, because it's very frustrating to mark. Always attempt every question. You may not be able to do every question, but you should at least attempt every question. And the financial reporting examiner has recently said then, Of his markers in this sit-in, one marker reported that she had lost count of the number of candidates that had scored 35 to 40 marks after completing the paper up to question 3A1. This was on the June paper, and that was 62 marks of the paper. And then following on from that, candidates had failed to score more than another 5 marks on the rest of the questions. So they did fine up to 3A1, and then after that, only 5 marks out of 38. You need to know the whole syllabus. You need to attempt every question. Let's move on now then and talk a bit more then about written questions. So, written questions. It's very, very important that you interpret your written requirements correctly. Now, each requirement will contain an instruction, which is a verb being a doing word like discuss, explain, identify, outline, a doing word. It will contain a verb and it will have some content, for example, what you should discuss. So start off then by underlining both your instruction and your content, and this will help you to focus your mind on the question. And when you're being asked to do more than one thing, for example, identify and explain, use these as headings in your answer. Because otherwise what you find may happen is you will identify whatever you need to identify, but you'll fail to explain it. And therefore you've potentially only scored half of your marks. So underline the instruction, underline the content, focus your mind, and all the way through that question, keep referring back to the requirement and saying, am I actually answering the question here? Keep looking back at it. We'll talk a little bit then more about the different verbs that can be used in these written requirements. I've actually written an article about this. I wrote it in 2009, so I'll mention a couple of the verbs here, and then it would be good for you to go away and have a read of the article. If I go through every single one of these requirements in detail, I may send you to sleep, and I don't want to do that. So I'm just going to pull out a couple here. So common requirements then. For example, describe. When you're being asked to describe something then, you're being asked to give some kind of narrative about it. For example then, if you're being asked to describe suitable non-financial performance indicators for a hospital, you might be describing things such as the number of patient complaints, the bed occupancy rate, or the number of admissions per employee. It wouldn't be enough to merely list the indicators. You'd have to go a step further and describe how they might be calculated. You know, in terms of how long you'd spend doing this, you should be guided by the marks available. Work out how much time you have, dependent on the marks that are available, and stick to that timing. That is your best guide always of how much to write. Other requirements you might have then: interpret, outline, compare, identify. You know, outline is obviously going to be a much briefer requirement. If you're being asked to outline something, then you could probably outline a bigger subject than you could merely describe, because you're saying less about it. Okay? Other common requirements then: discuss, explain, evaluate, suggest, justify. Again, you know, go away and have a read of the article, but I'll just pull one of them out and we'll talk about the discuss requirement then. So this is a higher level skill, and it requires candidates to give their own thoughts of the subject, supporting it with facts and logical reasoning. For example, you could be asked to discuss the effect that variances have on staff motivation. You'd need to discuss the fact that, for example, variances can be demotivational if they lead to managers being assessed for costs for which they are not able to control. So with discuss, you know, it's really quite a broad requirement. It's a good test of candidates' real understanding, and it's probably going to score you quite a few marks. It's going to be quite quite a big requirement as compared to something like outline. Please go away and look at the article, it'll be really useful. Let's talk a little bit then about how much should I write. And as I've just mentioned before, allocate your time to each question and its component parts at the beginning of the exam. That's your best guide. And then be really disciplined about sticking to your time allocation on each question. You know, you tend to find anyway that once students have gone past the time allocated for that question, they don't actually earn many marks after that. So please be disciplined with yourself. I find that on the whole, there aren't really any hard and fast rules, for example, that 1 point is worth 1 mark. It depends what you're being asked to do. If you're being asked to list something, then it's probably only worth half a mark per point. So you can't really assume that you get 1 mark per point or 2 mark per point or anything like that. Look at past questions, work out your timing, that's going to be your best guide. So less demanding instructions such as list or describe, they're going to be worth less marks per point than instructions such as discuss, describe or explain. Let's move on then and talk about calculation-based questions. It's really, really important that you set out your answers in an ordered, easy to follow manner, with your working clearly referenced into the main body of your answer. If you don't do this, you risk a marker being unable to follow your work and therefore being unable to allocate the proper marks. Also, if you make errors, if you've got all your workings clearly labelled, you'll be able to get the follow-on marks. You know, you make an error once in a paper, that doesn't mean you fail that question. If you follow on that mistake all the way through and it's clear exactly what you did, you're still going to score most of the marks if you've set it out properly. So please set it out, leave spaces between things, you know, make it easy for the marker to mark. One thing that often happens is you find a candidate struggling with a calculation and they just then seem to kind of lose it in the exam and they just give up and they cross out all of their work. Please don't do that. Fair enough, if you've made an attempt at a question, you've realised you've gone wrong, so you've crossed it out and then you've started again, that's fine. But if you've given up, just leave whatever you did and don't cross it out, and then the marker knows to mark it. You'll probably still have scored a reasonable number of marks, or at least some marks. It can't do any harm to leave it in there. There's no negative marking. In calculation-based questions then, you're probably going to have a lot of figures in the scenario itself. So make sure that when you've gone through doing your active reading, you've highlighted all the key figures so that you don't miss anything out. And importantly then, make sure you've got a scientific calculator with you. Again, I saw questions certainly in the December exam of my paper where candidates clearly had forgotten to take a scientific calculator in the exam. I don't really think there's any excuse for that. I mean, myself personally, I always used to take 2 calculators into an exam. I took a scientific calculator in for the calculations that required it, and I also took what I called an audit calculator. So this is a nice chunky calculator with chunky buttons. I called it an audit calculator because I used to use it on audit. Nothing cryptic about that really. And you find that with scientific calculators, the buttons are so small on it that actually it's not really good for adding up lists of numbers. So use your chunky audit calculator for all your quick calculations and just use your scientific calculator for when you have to. That also gives you a backup, well certainly in the case of the ordinary calculator, you know, if you have any problems with it in the exam hall. Basic points, but people fail because they don't listen to them. I had a tax lecturer when I was studying for my exams, and he used to spend, you know, nearly every lecture saying, "Get those easy marks, get those easy marks." And I used to get sick of hearing it, but in fact it was really such good advice. You know, every paper has a certain number of easy marks available. And the UK tax examiner then has said this: some areas of the paper offer the chance to score relatively easy marks quite quickly. In the June 2010 paper, such areas were the calculation of a tax-adjusted trading profit, a detailed capital allowances computation, Class 4 national insurance calculations, the calculation of a property business profit, and a capital gains tax share pool. Question practice and the appropriate use of performer layouts will mean that you can answer such areas without having to spend too much time planning your answers, and therefore have more time available for the rest of the paper. So make sure you get the relatively easy marks. You know, as with written questions, the marks available then are going to be your best guide as to how long a question should take you to answer. And if you look at a question and think, I've got 5 minutes to answer it in and it's going to take me 20 minutes, you should actually look at that question again and say, am I actually making this more complicated than it is? Because once again, the UK tax examiner has given some good advice on this and said the marks given per section are a very good guide to the amount of time that should be spent on a question. If a question is for 2 or 3 marks, then it should only take a few minutes to answer. If an answer appears to be much longer than this, then you should have another look at what is required. This situation often arises where a simple marginal tax rate calculation is required. A full tax calculation will obviously take much longer to do. Be careful of not making a question much more complicated than it really is. The June 2010 exam gave the output VAT and input VAT figures for a VAT calculation, so there was no need to actually calculate them. Good use of the reading time will avoid such problems. So again, good advice that can be applied, to many different subjects. Lastly then, let's move on to multiple choice questions. Now obviously, this won't be relevant to all of the fundamental level papers, but it's certainly relevant to some of them. You'll find a very good article has been written by Ronnie Patton, who's one of the CAT examiners. He wrote a very good article on MCQs, so I've just pulled out really a few key points from there. First point he made then was that you should read the question. Now, again, that sounds obvious, but so much time goes into writing one of these questions. You need to give it the time to read it and absorb it properly. A lot of discussion goes on for the exact wording used throughout the question, as is really, in fact, the case in any exam question on the paper. Every question is subjected to a number of rigorous reviews as it progresses from an idea in the writer's mind onto the actual exam paper itself. Now, because of these reviews, it means you need to read the question really carefully. The second point then of advice that Ronnie gave was think. Usually the answer will not be obvious. It's a common misconception to think that multiple choice questions are easy. They're not easy at all. The reason people kind of think they're easy is because the answer lies there on the paper. It's either A, B, C or D. But in fact, unless you know what the answer is, you've only got a 25% chance of getting it right if you guess it. Okay, so they're not easy at all. If a multiple choice question is easy, it's because you happen to know the answer because you've prepared for the exam. Let's have a look then at one of the sample questions from F1's pilot paper then. And this read as follows. Which one of the following is consistent with a government's policy objective to expand the level of economic activity? I feel like I'm on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire here. Is it A, an increase in taxation? B, an increase in interest rates? C, an increase in personal savings? Or D, an increase in public expenditure? Unfortunately, you're not going to win any money if you get this right, but we're going to talk about it anyway. So, all of the options then refer to matters that may be part of a government's policy to influence economic activity. So what the question is testing is the candidate's ability to determine how each of the matters will impact on economic activity. Selecting the correct answer then is going to be determined by how clearly you can think and logic through each of the options. If direct taxation then is increased, which was our option A there, then consumers are going to have less disposable income. While if indirect taxation is increased, prices will rise. Either of these then will have the effect of reducing consumer demand, so they'll lead to a contraction, not an expansion of economic activity. So A is definitely wrong. So then we move on to B, an increase in interest rates. Now, if interest rates rise, borrowing obviously becomes more expensive. And therefore, again, because most businesses and consumers borrow money, they're going to have less money to spend. So again, this is going to lead to a contraction and not an expansion of economic activity. Thirdly then, C, an increase in personal savings. Now, an increase in personal savings will mean that consumers again have less disposable income, and therefore C is also incorrect. Therefore, option D must be correct, and of course it is correct because an increase in public expenditure will increase demand in the economy, leading to an increase in economic activity. So you see, the question isn't actually as easy as it may have first looked. Ronnie then goes on to say in his article, and really you should go away and read this article because it's really good, it's essential that your answer is a result of a considered choice. This is because of the way that the incorrect answers have been constructed. He uses then a sample question from F2's pilot paper. Let's read this slowly because it takes a bit of absorbing. A beautiful variance question. A company's budgeted sales for last month were 10,000 units with a standard selling price of $20 per unit and a standard contribution of $8 per unit. So 10,000 units, $20, $8. Last month, actual sales of 10,500 units at an average selling price of $19.50 per unit were achieved. What were the sales price and sales volume contribution variances for last month? And then you can see in our left-hand column, we've got our sales price variance. In our right-hand column, we've got our sales volume contribution variance. So option A then, 5250 adverse on the sales price variance, 4,000 favourable on the volume contribution variance. Option B, 5250 adverse and 4,000 adverse. Option C, 5,000 adverse and 4,000 favourable. And option D, 5,000 adverse and 4,000 adverse. Now, because volume was greater than anticipated, because we've got actual volume of 10,500 units rather than our budgeted volume of 10,000 units, we know that the sales volume contribution variance must be favourable. And therefore, straight away, we can see that only options A and C can be correct. Also, there's no need to complete the calculation of this variance, and we'll see that when we start looking then at the sales price variance. So selecting the correct answer depends on correctly calculating the sales price variance. As the actual selling price was 50 cents per unit less than anticipated, the variance is adverse. The key issue is the volume which should be applied to the unit variance. Now, when calculating a price variance, we use actual volume every time. Therefore, the variance is based on 10,500 units, and the variance is therefore 10,500 units at 50 cents, which is 5250 adverse, or answer A. Now, obviously, the reason why we didn't need to calculate our sales volume contribution variance is because A and C both showed a variance of 4,000 favourable, so it had to be right. A good example, really, of how to approach a question. Ronnie goes on then in his article to talk about the fact that you need to work out the correct answer. You know, as the incorrect answers are based on common mistakes, it follows that attempting to guess the correct answer, it's not likely to be productive. Although, of course, you have got a 1 in 4 chance of getting it right. Rather then, it's essential that you use your understanding of the topic to work it out. Of course, if you run out of time, guess the ones that you haven't done. That was advice that my lecturers used to give me, and it was good advice. But on the whole, please try and work out the correct answers. Now, as you're going through and working out your answer, you'll probably find that you stumble across what we call the distractors. And the distractors are the wrong answers that you've been given. You know, so for example, if you're working out a capital allowance and you know that it's a capital allowance that needs to be time apportioned, then when you're in the process of working it out, you'll see the unapportioned capital allowance before you've time apportioned it, and you might look at your distractors and say, I can see that in there, but I know that's wrong because I need to time apportion it. So work out the correct answer, and as you're going through then, eliminate the wrong answers. And that moves us on then really to discursive questions, this idea of eliminating incorrect answers. And again, in his article, I don't want to pretend that I've made all this stuff up myself when it comes to MCQs, Ronnie did write them. He gave a question from the F2 pilot paper, and it reads as follows: the following statements relate to relevant cost concepts in decision making. 1. Materials can never have an opportunity cost, whereas labour can. 2. An annual depreciation charge is not a relevant cost. 3. Fixed costs would have a relevant cost element if a decision causes a change in their total expenditure. And then you're asked which statements are correct. Is it A, 1 and 2 only, or B, 1 and 3 only, C, 2 and 3 only, or D, 1, 2 and 3? Now, as you go through then, you can see straight away, if you go through each of your 1, 2 and 3 options in turn, you can see that straight away, option 1, materials can never have an opportunity cost, whereas labour can, you can see that that's incorrect. And therefore, when you look at options A, B, C and D, you can straight away eliminate A, B and D, because each of those includes saying that statement 1 is correct. And therefore you know by a process of elimination that C must be the correct answer. And then when you actually look at the question again and look at point 2 on depreciation, you say, yes, that's correct, it's not a relevant cost. And about fixed costs, yes, they are relevant if it causes an incremental change in expenditure. So you can see that C was the right answer and in fact is the right answer because you've worked it out. So in discursive questions, eliminate incorrect answers, and this can then help you to go on and identify the correct answer. In summary then, I'd just like to say then that work hard throughout your studies. Nothing is for free in life, and you will get out of it what you put in unless you're extremely lucky. Study all areas of the syllabus for whichever papers you're taking, and don't try and question spot. That's a very risky approach, and accountants by their nature are fairly risk averse, which is why we make poor entrepreneurs. Thirdly then, set out your answers clearly, making sure that your handwriting can be read. Fourthly, make sure you get the easy marks on the paper. And fifthly, and almost, most importantly of all, accept that you won't necessarily be able to do, in fact, you won't be able to do everything perfectly on the paper, and focus on what you can do. Always focus on what you can do rather than focusing on what you can't do. And every time you come to a question, look at it and don't be negative. Don't look at it as your glass being half empty. Look at it as your glass being half full. I can do X, Y and Z, so I know enough here to get half marks or more on this question. We all look for perfection in life. Go into that exam, doing your best and doing what you can and just thinking, I only need to do enough to pass. Half of it really, maybe not half of it, but some of it is about exam technique. And then the rest of it is about working really hard. Good luck.
Hello, my name is Jonathan Mbewe. I'm the Tuition Support Manager at ACCA. We have received a large number of questions from you, and Anne and I will try to answer some of them. And the first question comes from Pakistan, and it's from Aslam. What are the key points that we should consider before the exams, and what does the examiner expect from the students?
Okay, thank you. Before the exam, you should largely be guided by the syllabus and the study guide in order to get an idea of what subjects you need to have a good grasp of before you go into the exam hall. You've also got quite a lot of resources at your fingertips, so you've got all the past exam papers which you can access directly through the ACCA's website. You've got all the technical articles that have been written not only by the examiner but also by other people as well, which will give you, a resource to go to should you require a bit more knowledge about a specific area. You've got the examiner's reports that he writes or she writes after the end of each exam, and they're a really good source of what went wrong during the exam for certain students and therefore what you should avoid. And on top of that also, you know, what it may be worth looking at, in fact would be worth looking at the beginning, are the examiner's interviews that are on the ACCA's website.
All right, thanks for that answer. The next question I've got is from Felicia in Trinidad. When marking the exam papers, if a student receives a mark of 49%, does the examiner go over the script again?
Absolutely. You know, all marginal scripts are reviewed. You can be rest assured really that if you got 49%, it was a marginal fail. It wasn't some kind of an accident. Yes, you were very near the pass mark, but someone has reviewed that paper and it was definitely a fail, although, you know, a disappointing one.
Okay, thanks for that answer. Sajawa from Pakistan sent the next question. How do you decide if the time allocated to the paper is sufficient?
The paper goes through an amazingly rigorous process like you wouldn't believe, you know, starting off really with a panel meeting where lots of people sit round and review the exam paper. And other steps I won't mention, but one step I will mention is that every exam paper is sat by what we call an exam sitter. And that's a person that is experienced really at judging exam papers. Now what they do is they start off with sitting the exam paper themselves, making a note of how long it took them to do each question, making a note of how long they think it should take the reasonably prepared student to do each question, and therefore checking that the length is absolutely spot on. You know, adjustments are often made at this stage of the process, you know, if it's considered that a question is either too long or sometimes too short.
So that particular stage, the sitter stage, is one of many stages.
One of many stages. I mean, the lead time on an exam paper is long. You know, we're probably looking at, you know, close on 18 months from the beginning of the paper being written
to the time the student actually
sits the paper. To the time the student sits it. So a lot of checks. Thanks
very much for that answer. Sophia from Greece sent in a question. Do you think it would be more helpful for students to have a choice of questions in an exam rather than all the questions being compulsory as they are at the moment?
Not at a fundamental level paper, no, because the idea of a fundamental level paper is that it covers core knowledge that you must have. So, for example, it's no good saying that on paper F5, performance management, it's okay not to know about transfer pricing, or it's okay not to know about linear programming, as long as you know about, you know, costing or something like that. You can't do that. This is fundamental knowledge. So no, I think you need to have all compulsory questions at this level. And then at the professional stage, that's a good opportunity to be more selective.
So does that have a bearing on how much then a student should study in a particular syllabus?
Absolutely, because the student needs to study every part of the syllabus.
Okay, thanks very much. Then I've got a question from Armenia, and it's from Tigran. Do you think that 3 hours for your paper, F5, is sufficient time for 5 questions? They used to be 4 questions. Now you've got 5 questions and it's still 3 hours.
Yeah, that's a good question, thank you. Now, obviously, the paper was changed from being 4 questions to being 5 questions because it was felt that sometimes those 25-mark questions were too long for students, and it took them too long to actually get to grips with the question before they were able to answer it. So the idea was that by having 5 slightly shorter questions, the questions would be more accessible. So yes, there are 5 questions, but each question's a little bit shorter, and therefore the timing, you know, should be perfect. This is something that was done to help students rather than to hinder them, and it gives me more opportunity to test an extra area of the syllabus or more than one area within that extra question as well.
Okay, so you're comfortable that, you know, 3 hours for 5 questions is reasonable for...
Absolutely, because they're 5 20-mark questions.
Okay, thank you. Why is there such a drastic change in the paper F7 setting? And this is a question that came from Oman, from Nitish, I beg your pardon.
Okay, well, I've actually spoken to the examiner, Steve Scott, about this to find out, you know, what he wanted to say about it. And I'll refer to what he said to me. He said that he doesn't regard there as having been any kind of drastic change in the paper setting. Now, he said if compared to paper 10, the questions are all compulsory, and question 4 is now worth 15 marks and question 5 is now worth 10 marks, and therefore they're shorter than previous questions because the previous questions were all worth 25 marks. So yeah, there's a little bit of a change there. He also went on to say that question 1 on groups and question 2 on preparing company financial statements, they've not changed at all in the way they're set or the degree of difficulty, although he said that obviously changes to IFRS 3 will inevitably impact on question 1.
Did you say anything about question number 3?
Yeah, he did talk about question 3, and he said that, you know, where it could be argued that there has been a change in question 3, he specifically said at the last teachers' conference that he would try to make this question more focused. Now, in terms of what he means by that, he said, well, he may, for example, ask for extracts of cash flows rather than always a full statement of cash flows. Similarly, with regards to interpretation aspects, he's trying to move away from a kind of rote-learned, formulaic approach to answers. You know, because he's found that often answers don't even refer to the circumstances of the scenario. And what students do is just calculate the ratios in the same order and then rarely even analyse them. You know, they merely state that this ratio's gone up by this percent and this ratio's gone down by this percent. So they're just rote learning stuff and regurgitating it without referring back to the scenario. And in order to move away from this then, in June 2009, for example, he targeted the causes of changes in the gross profit margin. And in December 2009, he asked students to focus on analysing the return on capital employed. And then again, to do something slightly different in June 2010, the focus was on whether or not to grant the renewal of a loan, using info that was from a prepared cash flow.
What was his general overview of the paper?
Well, his general feel about this paper was that there weren't really any standout reasons, you know, why the pass rates are difficult at the moment. And, you know, he's included in his report, and indeed in all his report, many examples of students' failings, but they're not new issues. It just seems that they're becoming more and more prevalent.
All right. So at this point, would we be right to say maybe students should refer specifically to his reports to get a feel of what is going wrong with candidates?
Absolutely, you know, absolutely,
paper?
And of course we could apply that in any subject.
Thanks. The next question I have is from Stephen in Singapore. I heard that ACCA are going to change the syllabus for papers F1 to F3. Yeah. What will these changes be?
Well, the reason for these changes was because the occupational standards for accountancy at this level changed. So, you know, firstly, we're not changing things for the sake of changing sake. We've changed them because we've had to change them. The main changes to F1 then are a greater emphasis on the types of accounting reports produced by businesses. So there's more on accounting systems and on detection and prevention of fraud, including money laundering offences and employee and employer obligations. So that's a start really, and the F1 syllabus generally then contains more about ethics and conflict resolution. Moving on to F2 then, that's more clearly focused now on planning and control, with more explicit content on budgeting, standard costing, and it includes a new section on performance measurement, one of my lovely subjects from F5. And F3 then includes more emphasis on accounts preparation. And it also includes an introduction to group accounting and the interpretation of accounts.
But there are no new papers. It's just.
It's not no. It's just the current papers have been, you know, they've been amended, and the structure as well of the papers in terms of the questions, the types of questions that have been asked, they've been changed as well. And you know, I won't go on about that now, but you can go away and have a look at the ACCA's website because the new study guides are there for everyone to have a look at.
And when are these changes due?
December 2011.
Thank you. Well, the next question is uniquely yours, Anne. And it comes from Javid in the UK, and I will read it as it is.
Okay.
I'm very impressed with your qualifications.
Thank you.
And want to know how you did it as a student. How did you prepare for your exams?
Okay, I'd like to say there's some kind of magic formula for passing exams, but that would be an absolute lie. Firstly, I guess I was luckier than some people in that I always had access to full tuition. And that does give you a good start. I also recognise the fact that just because you have full tuition doesn't mean that you don't need to do anything at home. So, you know, every day that I had of tuition was matched by a day at home. You know, probably 3 hours in the evening of the day I'd had the tuition, and then at least another 3 hours at another time. So I always did follow up my tuition with studying myself. I always made sure that I booked holidays off work around exam time so that I could study for, you know, the weeks leading up to the exam. I didn't go on glamorous holidays, and I couldn't afford it then anyway. So, you know, I dedicated myself to the mission of passing exams. And, you know, to be honest, you make a sacrifice. You do the exams, you sacrifice your free time at that stage for the greater good of your life on the whole. And, you know, to be honest, whilst a lot of my friends were going out partying, I obviously did some of that, but when I was doing exams and I wasn't going out. So you kind of, you do feel like you're missing out, but it's so worth it.
All right, okay. And it got you through?
Got me through, yeah.
Yeah, I think we should at this point, if you don't mind, and go back to your presentation. You did refer to two ways, effectively two ways of studying on your own or attending tuition on the other hand. And I think for the benefit of the rest of the students, I think they should be aware that we do recommend, wherever you can, we do recommend that you go and get tuition support face-to-face if you can, but we also recognize there are markets where face-to-face tuition is not available, and studying on your own could be challenging in certain papers. There are other ways of getting support, online, distance learning, any form of support where somebody is helping you through will be something that will help you get the best possible chance of passing these exams.
Yeah.
Right, the next question is from Nairobi, and it's from Rajvi. I'm studying on my own, there we go, and want to know how best to plan and complete a safe study program.
Okay, I think firstly, you know, you have to decide how many papers do I want to sit, and you need to be realistic about this. You know, you need to look at what kind of hours you work, what your other commitments are out of work. I mean, a lot of people that study for these exams may already, you know, have a small child. So look at realistically what fits in with you, and if you've got family, what fits in with your family. That's your starting point. Having decided that, then you need to go on and set yourself a study plan, working out, you know, when you're actually going to start it. And, you know, you need to be disciplined about sticking to that study plan. You know, having said that, any study plan really is a bit like a rolling budget. You know, things happen in your life that you can't always predict, and you know, you may have to amend your study plan as you go along, or you'll hit an area of the syllabus, you don't understand it, and suddenly you find yourself spending a week on it. So, you know, it's stick to your study plan, but make sure that you tweak it as well when you need to. You can actually go and read an article about this in Student Accountant, so that's another good source of information for you.
Is there any other support that ACCA provides to students like Rajvi who are studying on their own, on the website and stuff?
The website's absolutely a great source of resources. You know, you've got all the past exam papers on there. You've got all the technical articles on there. You've obviously got the syllabus and the study guide. You know, go and have a look on it. There's a lot of stuff on there to help you, and it's all free.
Thank you. The next question comes from Alex in Hong Kong. I've taken and failed paper F9 several times. Please give me some advice on how to prepare for this paper.
In F9 really is not dissimilar from any of the other subjects. You know, the whole syllabus is examinable, so obviously you need to go into that exam hall being comfortable with the whole syllabus. Similarly, it could be that a single question can cover more than one area of the syllabus, so you need to expect that. I think the problem is with F9, you know, that people will sometimes just try and rote learn calculations without actually understanding the theory and the concepts behind those calculations. So you need to make sure you don't try and rote learn calculations, but you understand what it actually means, so that if a question's a little bit different, you're still able to tackle it. Study past papers, as you know, as with all the fundamental papers, and you know, noting the style and structure of the questions, how suggested answers relate to each question asked. You know, do the pilot paper if possible under exam conditions, you know, i.e. attempt it in 3 hours, or at least attempt some of the past papers in the 3 hours. With F9, you know, it is important that you develop a methodical approach to financial analysis and financial calculations in answering questions. And of course, go away and have a look at the relevant articles in Student Accountant.
Oh, thanks very much. I hope this will help Alex in Hong Kong.
I hope so.
Well, the next question comes from me.
Okay.
And if you were to give one piece of advice to students as to how best to approach their papers, what would that advice be?
First of all, work hard. You know, nothing comes for free in life. Everything has a cost, and at this stage, the cost, as well as any financial cost to you, is your time that you put into it. You know, you only get out of things what you put into them. So work hard. The second piece of advice really would be to study effectively. You know, we've all had friends. I remember one of my best friends at university. Every day she used to get up at 9 o'clock and go to the library, and she'd turn up back home again at 6 o'clock, which was more than most of us did. But you could guarantee if you went to the library that day, you'd find her standing outside half the day, or she was chatting to people, or she was in the cafeteria drinking coffee. So study effectively. When you've set aside time to study, you know, make sure that you do study. And then, of course, you know, use all the resources that are available to you. Work through all the past papers, read all the technical articles, look at all the examiner's reports, look at the examiner's interview. You know, get to know the examiner for your subject as well as you possibly can.
All right. Well, that sounds like good advice. Well, I'm afraid this is all we had time for, and I hope you found the questions and answers useful, and good luck in your next exam. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan.